Shalom, guys. Welcome back to another episode here at YASHAV Youth Ministries with Casa de Israel. Thank you again for being there. Now, I always say, if you like the content that we have in our channel, like and subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, put it in the comment section down below. So, lately I've been putting up some videos based on the studies and the classes I've been doing with the youth foundation. Soon I'll be uploading other topics that we are talking about in our classes, and so if you also like those, share and also like and subscribe and comment on those as well. And so we're going to continue with our weekly portion. We're going to Torah portion today, probably be a little short, with Torah portion Pinchas. We have talked a lot about this first part of the Torah portion of Pinchas, and I think today we will talk one more time a little bit of certain elements in this narrative, and then maybe the next cycle we'll talk about the daughters of Zelophehad, obviously the census, and the importance of semicha, right? That appointment that is in this Torah portion where Moses has to begin to transition his role, because he is going to part from the people, from his life as of now, and then he has to make sure that the people of Israel have a leader that is going to guide them and lead them into the promised land. Okay, so before we get started, let's do the Torah blessing. Baruch Adonai Haorah, Baruch Adonai Haorah leolam ba'et, Baruch Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, ונתן לנו את תורתו. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Bless Adonai who's blessed, bless Adonai who's blessed now and forever. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has chosen us from among the peoples and given us the Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, giver of the Torah. Amen. So, like I said, this week's Torah portion is Pinchas. It is in Numbers 25, verse 10 to Numbers 29, verse 40. The Haftarah portion, or the new or the prophet's portion, is 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 46 to 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 21. And the Brit Hadashah New Testament portion is Revelation 19, verse 11 through 21. Last week's Torah portion, Balak, introduced us to Phinehas, or Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, and the grandson of Aaron, who, during the rebellion of Baal Peor, zealously removed evil from Israel by driving a spear through a tribal prince who was brazenly coveting with a Midianite princess in defiance of God's law. On account of Pinchas' zeal for the Torah, God stopped the plague and Israel was delivered from destruction. And so here is the case in which Balak, afraid of how Israel is marching in order and structure in obedience to God, after the serpent, the copper serpent, caused to Balaam, because of Israel's defeating of Sihon and Og. They seem unstoppable, and so as they approach Balak, Balak calls Balaam so they can curse Israel. God tells Balaam, you can't. Balaam then gets a little greedy and gets a little sneaky and tries to see if God will change his mind. And so in the process, Balaam ends up blessing Israel multiple times. And Balak eventually recognizes that there's nothing he can do to Israel ritualistically and spiritualistically if they are walking in obedience and God is leading them. And so eventually the narrative describes how Balaam then decides to say, well, we can curse them ritualistically or spiritualistically. I don't know if that's even a word. But there's something that we can do. And so the people, in this moment of positivity and structure, are enticed by the the Midianite women, and they are basically lured to worship other deities, mainly Baal Peor. And so that is where we are. And so the people of Israel, instead of keeping on the march and continue their trend towards the promised land, they settle, right? They not only stop and worship, they settle for a time being, okay? And so this week's portion, Pinchas, begins with the Lord rewarding Pinchas by granting him a covenant of peace. A Brit Kehuna Olam. Okay? And officially promising to incorporate him into the priestly line of Israel. This promise was remarkable because Pinchas was technically not qualified to be a priest, since he was already born when the original promise was given to Aaron and his sons, and since his father Eliezer was married to an outsider, namely the daughter of Jethro, also called Putiel. Now, let's get into the reading. It says, Pinchas, son of Eliezer, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from Israel, since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am, and I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore, tell him I'm making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites. The name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Zalu, the leader of the Simonite family. And the name of the Midianite woman was put to death was Cosbi, daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of the Midianite family. And so in the process of this idol worship, Simri and Cosby go into this tent, and they do idol worship in this tent right now. It is believed, or it has been believed, that they had gone to the tabernacle, but they did not go into the tabernacle. They necessarily did not go into the tabernacle. They had a ritual tent in which they were going into this tent to do a ritual of fertility, and so that is the equivalent of them profaning the camp and the sanctuary, right? Because the whole area where Adonai's presence is holy, and so the act of these people in the presence of God, in the community of God, trying to worship another deity is a form of rebellious sin, which there is no sin for, and so no forgiveness for. And so that is the situation that we find ourselves in. And Pinchas demonstrates desire and interest and zealousy for God's camp and God's community, right? And he takes it upon himself to fulfill the judgment of God based on the worship and idolatry that was happening in the name of Baal Peor. Okay, and so he is rewarded with this covenant of peace, and he is able to bring ransom to these people that are going to be dying because of the sin of these leaders. The major critical problem in the text of Baal Peor incident is that the solution to the crisis offered by God and Moses do not agree with each other, and that neither one is actually fulfilled. God orders that impalement of all the leaders. Moses orders the judges to slay all the idolaters, and neither is done. A third solution, then, the slaying by Pinchas of a sinning couple in a flagrant appeases God's wrath. And so Aaron's grandson Phinehas left the prayer meeting and went after the couple, killing both of them in the tent with one thrust of his spear. This stopped the plague, but not before 24,000 people had died. Like Abraham when he offered up Isaac, Phinehas proved his faith by his works. and it was counted to him for righteousness. And so we're seeing how this voluntary act to take matters into his own hands and become, in this moment, this situation, the image of God, understanding the situation that there is idolatry, and there is not only idolatry but rebellious idolatry. When Cosby and Simri are going to, in a tent in the camp, going to have a sexual worship for fertility in the presence of God, that act doesn't take or need any merit of judgment or discernment, right? The act itself is of punishable by death, meaning that they are encroaching, they are contaminating, they are polluting the community in the sanctuary with their worship of Baal Peor. And so Pinchas, instead of falling to his face and praying, he recognized that in that moment in time, the right thing to do was to intervene. And in this case, it was at the end of his spear through Simri and Cosby. But that gave him and gave the people ransom. It stopped the plague, and there were still consequences for the disobedience and the stumbling of the people. Now, Psalm 106, verse 28-31 says, "The yoke themselves to Baal Peor, and ate sacrifice offered to lifeless gods. They aroused the Lord's anger by their wicked deeds, and a plague broke out among them. But Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was checked. This was credited to him as righteousness for endless generations to come." So this voluntary action to stand for God and to honor God's word and understand and recognize that the sanctuary and the community itself is very important, it is holy. All right? And so in a blatant act of disobedience and rebellious sin, Pinchas decides to do or commit an action out of order in this case, meaning that it was something that came out of nowhere and is unexpected. And there's a lot of people and a lot of wisdom writing that disagrees with how he reacted, but overall is understood that he stood for the honor of God, which is clearly the most important element in this narrative. And because he stood for God's honor, it was credited to him as righteousness. Okay, the same way that Abraham did, and the same way that Noah did. So, because of his zeal for the honor of the Lord, Phinehas was given the special reward of a lasting priesthood for himself and his descendants. Phinehas knew nothing about this reward before he acted, right? Understanding this, so his motive wasn't a selfish one. He was motivated by his zeal for the honor of God and the authority of his law. Phinehas went with Moses when Israel attacked the Midianites. So he wasn't afraid of a battle. He also was in charge of the gatekeepers at the tabernacle and had the presence of the Lord with him in his ministry. Guarding God's sanctuary was a very responsible task, but Phinehas had the conviction and courage to do it well. Right? So it shows a selflessness in his leadership that also granted him this opportunity and this blessing that came directly from God, right? A covenant of peace, and some interpretation it says is a covenant with peace, right? And so either way, a covenant with God that involves peace is great, right? So Balaam, which is one of the central pieces in this whole dynamic between Balak and Pinchas, right? Because Balaam is the prophet that tries to curse, understanding that he can't, and decides to go anyways. And in the process, he blesses Israel, and still in recognition that he can't curse them, he can only bless them, he decides to let Balak and his people know that they can entice the people to idol worship. Okay, so this leader, this Balaam, who recognized God's voice and understood it, also was guided by his greed and his personal desires. And so it gives a very vivid example of how can someone still listen to God's word, know God's will, and still guide others to do the opposite. And so the way of Balaam is a lifestyle as a soothsayer, a false prophet. His motive was to make money, and he used his opportunities not to serve God and his people, but to satisfy his craving for wealth. In other words, he was a hireling who sold himself to the highest bidder. He used religion only to make money and to cover up his sinful cravings. He also used religion to entice people to sin. Balaam knew that God didn't want him to go with the delegation and serve King Balak, but he maneuvered around God's declared will and went to Moab. The British minister, F.W. Robertson, said he went to God to get his duty altered, not to learn what his duty was. No matter what he said with his lips, Balaam had a hidden agenda that really wasn't hidden from God at all. If God isn't allowed to rule in a person's life, he overrules and accomplishes his purpose just the same. But the disobedient servant is the loser. And it's very interesting because Balaam is not denied that he has a gift, he has an ability, because God does speak to him. But even with his gift and his ability, he still is guided by this case, flesh, right? And his intrusive thoughts to gain something, to have the ability to sway Adonai. And it's very interesting how in the narrative and in the text, God is very clear that even though he ends up letting Balaam go, his declared judgment upon what Balaam was trying to do didn't change. He said, you can't curse him. And even though God said, go and curse him, he couldn't, because the people of Israel were in order and they were structured, but they were not completely aware of what was ahead of them. That even though they were ritually and outwardly holy and orderly, internally they needed to be stronger, and they needed to remember that they had to be a constant reminder of who they represented and who they were called to worship. And it was only Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. Okay? So 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 14 to 19 says, with eyes full of adultery, they never stop sinning. They seduce the unstable. They are experts in greed and accursed brood. They have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Bezer. He who loved the wages of wickedness, but he was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, an animal without speech, who spoke with a human voice and restrained the prophet madness. These people are springs without water, and mist driven by a storm. Blackest darkness is reserved for them, for they mouth empty, boastful words, and by appealing to the lust desires of flesh, they entice people who are just escaping from those who live in error. They promise them freedom, while they themselves are slaves of depravity, for people are slaves to whatever has mastered them. And here, I'm making a very conscious contrast, right? I'm letting you know that random acts of Pinchas, standing for God's righteousness and God's word and God's holiness, and the acts of Balaam, who was gifted, who had an ability to manipulate, had the ability to talk to the deity himself. But in both cases, you see that there's a difference. The difference is one is seeking God's will, and one is seeking, in this case, men's will, men's desire, the flesh, right? The way that is described in the New Testament. And so you have to be conscious that you either are a Pinchas, meaning that under the most extreme circumstances, you have to stand for God, because God is not going to change, and God's righteousness does not change. Balaam thought that God's judgment and righteousness will change based on his ability and power. Pinchas recognized that he was only doing God's will. He was a servant, fulfilling his duty, protecting God's honor. Okay? And so, it's interesting because in this portion, and we're not going to talk that much about this, but eventually we will. It says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Go up to this mountain in Abraham range and see the land I have given to the Israelites. After you have seen it, you too will be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was. For when the community rebelled at the waters and the desert of sin, both of you disobeyed my command to honor me as holy before their eyes. Okay, again, God's holiness comes before everything. These were the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the desert of sin. Moses said to the Lord, May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in. So the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. So this is the standard, the ideal leader that Moses is praying for. In this case, Adonai picks Joshua. Joshua is one of those that came from the spies with the right report and had the ability to recognize God's promises and God's word above what the spies saw, those 10 spies that talked against God. And so here, the prayer that Moses seeks is someone that's willing and is able to bring the people in and out, that it is able to lead the people, right? And in the presence of Pinchas is given a covenant of peace, or a covenant with peace, understanding that they both have stood for God's righteousness. And if you see the common denominator in these stories, Caleb, Joshua, Pinchas, Moses. Why doesn't Moses and Aaron go into the land? Because they didn't stand for God's holiness and God's righteousness. But before that, they were the leaders that were guiding these people in the desert, because they were standing for God's holiness and God's righteousness. They understood that they were guided and directed and led by the Father, not by their own desires and their own interpretations and intentions. Okay? So, it is clear. You have to be conscious of how you walk, where you're walking, but above all, whose steps are you walking on? Who is the one that is guiding those steps that you're taking? I've been telling the youth that the whole point of being born of the Spirit, or being born again, has to do with your perception of creation and understanding that you have to eliminate everything that you understand to be the norm, to recognize that creation in nature itself, how everything designed based on what God ordered and structured from the beginning, that essence that ties completely to the Creator, is what you have to become. You have to become a vessel that is willing to be led by the shepherd, a sheep that is willing to be led and is willing to stand for God's righteousness when it's needed. So, that's all I got for this week. I hope you learned something new. If you did not, I appreciate for being there and listening. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Shavua Tov and Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.